The pastor stole $50,000 from church funds until I exposed him on Sunday service. 77-year-old Annabelle Jenkins had been a faithful member of Mount Olive Baptist Church for 42 years, serving as treasurer for the last 15 years. When she discovered that Pastor Daniel Matthews had been systematically stealing money from the church building fund that was supposed to renovate the sanctuary, Annabelle had always been meticulous with church finances, keeping detailed records of every donation, every expense, and every transaction. But lately, Pastor Matthews had been pressuring her to give him more direct access to the church accounts, claiming it would streamline operations and reduce her workload. What Annabelle didn't know was that Pastor Matthews was drowning in gambling debts and had been using church money to pay off dangerous people who were threatening his family. It started small. Pastor Matthews would ask Annabelle to write checks for urgent repairs or emergency expenses that never seemed to materialize. When Annabelle asked for receipts or documentation, Pastor Matthews would claim the vendors were still processing paperwork or he was waiting for invoices. Annabelle began to feel uncomfortable with the lack of documentation, but Pastor Matthews was persuasive and charismatic, always explaining away her concerns with smooth words about trusting in God's provision and not being too focused on worldly accounting. But Annabelle was a retired bookkeeper who had managed finances for 40 years, and she knew that God's work still required honest record keeping. The first major red flag came when Pastor Matthews asked Annabelle to transfer $25,000 from the building fund to a general operating account, claiming there was an urgent need to pay for heating repairs before winter. Annabelle wrote the check as requested, but when she followed up weeks later about the heating repair receipts, Pastor Matthews became defensive and accused her of not trusting his leadership. Annabelle decided to do some investigating on her own. She called the heating company that allegedly did the emergency repairs, only to learn that no work had been performed at the church in over 2 years. When Annabelle confronted Pastor Matthews about this discrepancy, he claimed there had been a miscommunication, that the money had actually been used for plumbing repairs. Annabelle called the plumbing company and again learned that no recent work had been done at the church. Over the next month, Annabelle systematically checked every expense that Pastor Matthews had claimed, tracking down vendors, service providers, only to discover that most of the work he claimed to have paid for had never been performed. Annabelle realized that Pastor Matthews had stolen at least $50,000 from the church building fund, money that had been donated by faithful congregation members, their pastor, to use it for God's work. Annabelle knew she had to expose Pastor Matthews, but she also knew that he was beloved by many congregation members who would find it difficult to believe their spiritual leader was a thief. Annabelle decided to gather irrefutable evidence before making any accusations. She began photocopying all financial records, documenting every suspicious transaction, and creating a timeline of Pastor Matthews' thefts. She also started secretly recording conversations with Pastor Matthews using a small digital recorder she kept in her purse. During one conversation, Pastor Matthews admitted that he had used some church money for personal expenses, but claimed it was temporary and that he planned to pay it back. Annabelle asked him how much money he had taken, and Pastor Matthews said it was only about $10,000, but Annabelle's investigation showed it was much more. Annabelle also discovered that Pastor Matthews had opened a secret bank account using the church's tax identification number, but listing himself as the sole signatory. This account contained over $30,000 that should have been in the church building fund. Annabelle knew she had enough evidence to prove Pastor Matthews' guilt, but she wanted to expose him in a way that would ensure the entire congregation understood what had happened. Annabelle decided to reveal Pastor Matthews' crimes during Sunday service, when the entire congregation would be present, and Pastor Matthews would have no opportunity to spin the story or make excuses privately. Annabelle spent weeks preparing her presentation, creating a detailed financial report that showed exactly how much money Pastor Matthews had stolen and when each theft had occurred. She also prepared copies of bank statements, canceled checks, and recorded conversations that proved Pastor Matthews had been lying to the congregation about church finances. The Sunday Annabelle chose for her revelation was particularly significant because it was the same day Pastor Matthews was scheduled to present his annual stewardship sermon about the importance of faithful giving. Annabelle arrived at church early that morning carrying a briefcase full of evidence and a heavy heart about what she was about to do. She loved her church and her congregation, and she knew that exposing Pastor Matthews would cause pain and division in the community. She had served for decades, but Annabelle also knew that allowing Pastor Matthews to continue stealing from the church would be an even greater betrayal of the faith and trust that congregation members had placed in their spiritual leader. The service began normally with hymns, prayers, and announcements. Annabelle sat in her usual pew near the front, clutching her briefcase and waiting for the right moment. Pastor Matthews delivered his sermon about stewardship with his usual passion and eloquence, urging congregation members to give generously to support the church's ministry and building renovation project. Annabelle listened to Pastor Matthews talk about the importance of honesty, integrity, and faithful stewardship, knowing that he had violated every principle he was preaching. When Pastor Matthews finished his sermon, asked if anyone had questions or comments. Annabelle stood up slowly and walked to the front of the church. The congregation murmured quietly as Annabelle took her place at the podium. Clearly intending to address the church, Pastor Matthews looked surprised and somewhat annoyed, but smiled and said, "Sister Jenkins has something to share with us." Annabelle looked out at the congregation filled with people she had known and loved for decades. People who trusted her with their tithes and offerings, people who deserved to know the truth. She began by thanking the congregation for their faith-giving and their trust in her as church treasurer. Then she said that as treasurer she had a responsibility to report serious financial irregularities that she had discovered. The church became completely silent as Annabelle explained that over $50,000 was missing from the building fund money that should have been used to renovate the sanctuary. Annabelle presented her evidence methodically and calmly, showing bank statements that proved money had been transferred from church accounts to personal accounts controlled by Pastor Matthews. She played audio recordings of Pastor Matthews admitting that he had taken church money for personal use. She showed canceled checks made out to companies that had never performed any work for the church. With each piece of evidence, the congregation grew more shocked and upset. Several people began crying. Others looked angry. People got up and walked out. Pastor Matthews tried to interrupt Annabelle several times, claiming that she was confused or mistaken, but Annabelle had prepared for his objections. She addressed each of Pastor Matthews' excuses, showing documentation that proved he had been lying about emergency repairs, temporary loans, and miscommunication with vendors. When Annabelle finished her presentation, the church was in complete chaos. Some congregation members were demanding that Pastor Matthews explain himself. Others were calling for his immediate resignation. Pastor Matthews tried to give a response, claiming that he had only borrowed money temporarily due to a family emergency and that he had every intention of paying it back. But Annabelle showed bank records proving that Pastor Matthews had been taking money for over 2 years and had never made any attempt to repay what he had stolen. She also revealed that the secret bank account Pastor Matthews had opened contained gambling withdrawals and payments to sports betting websites. The congregation was devastated to learn that their pastor had not only stolen from the church, but had used their donations to fund a gambling addiction. Several deacons immediately called for an emergency board meeting to address the crisis and determine next steps. Pastor Matthews realized that his position was hopeless and that he could not explain away the overwhelming evidence of his theft. He stood up in front of the congregation with tears in his eyes and admitted that he had made terrible mistakes. He claimed that gambling addiction had taken control of his life and that he had never intended to hurt the church or betray the congregations. Pastor Matthews begged for forgiveness and promised to pay back every penny he had stolen, but the damage was done. The congregation voted unanimously to terminate Pastor Matthews immediately and to report his crimes to the police. Annabelle worked with church leadership and law enforcement to ensure that all stolen funds were recovered and that Pastor Matthews faced appropriate legal consequences. Pastor Matthews was charged with embezzlement, fraud, and theft. He pleaded guilty to avoid a trial and was sentenced to 3 years in prison plus restitution to the church. The church struggled for months to recover from the scandal. Many members left feeling betrayed and disillusioned. Others worked to rebuild trust and restore the church's financial integrity. Annabelle continued serving as treasurer, but implemented new financial controls to prevent future embezzlement, including requiring multiple signatures on large expenditures and monthly financial reports to the congregation. She also worked with other churches in the area to share information about financial safeguards and warning signs of pastoral misconduct. The church eventually hired a new pastor who was transparent about finances and committed to rebuilding the congregation's trust building renovation project was completed using recovered funds, plus additional donations from members who wanted to support the church's renewal. Annabelle's story became well known in religious communities as an example of the importance of financial oversight and accountability in church leadership. She often spoke at church conferences about the responsibility of lay leaders to protect congregations from financial abuse, even when it involves popular or charismatic pastors. Annabelle emphasized that exposing Pastor Matthew's crimes had been one of the most difficult things she had ever done, but that protecting the church and its members from continued theft was more important than avoiding conflict. She also pointed out that Pastor Matthew's gambling addiction was a serious problem that required treatment, but that stealing from the church was a choice that had consequences. Annabelle Jenkins proved that faithful church service sometimes requires courage to confront wrongdoing, even when it involves beloved leaders. Her willingness to expose Pastor Matthew's crimes protected the church from further financial loss and demonstrated that no one is above accountability when they betray the trust placed in them. The scandal at Mount Olive Baptist Church became a cautionary tale about the importance of financial transparency in religious organizations and the responsibility of church members to ask hard questions when something doesn't seem right. Annabelle continued to serve her church faithfully for several more years, always remembering that protecting the congregation sometimes required making difficult decisions that others might not understand. She proved that being a faithful Christian meant standing up for truth and justice, even when it was painful, and that God's work required honest stewardship of the resources entrusted to religious communities. Pastor Matthew's eventual release from prison was accompanied by a lifetime ban from church leadership and a requirement to continue making restitution payments. Annabelle's story inspired other church members across the country to take more active roles in financial oversight and to remember that blind trust in religious leaders can sometimes enable rather than prevent wrongdoing. She showed that the meek might inherit the earth, but they also had a responsibility to protect it from those who would exploit faith for personal gain. Annabelle Jenkins proved that exposing corruption in the house of God required both courage and faith, and that sometimes the most faithful act a church member can perform is refusing to remain silent when witnessing betrayal.